A wealthy CEO discovered that his maid had been writing about him every single night for 11 years, and what she wrote destroyed everything he believed about his own family. This is that story. Richard Keene was 53 years old. He had built a pharmaceutical company from nothing. He had a penthouse in Manhattan, a beach house in the Hamptons, and $17 million in his personal accounts. But on a Tuesday morning in October, Richard was on his knees in a small room in his own house, a room he had never entered, holding a worn leather diary that belonged to his maid. His hands were shaking, his eyes were wet, and on the page in front of him, in handwriting so neat it looked like a schoolteacher's, were the words, "Today I watched my son eat dinner at the long table again. He did not know I was watching. He does not know I am his mother." Richard read that line 4 times. Then he closed the diary, pressed it against his chest, and made a sound that no one in that house had ever heard him make. What he did next would cost him his closest relationship, expose a lie that had been running for over 3 decades, and bring him face to face with a truth so painful that money could not soften it. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? New York, London, maybe South Africa or Jamaica? We want to know. Now, to understand what Richard found in that diary, we need to go back, way back, to the kind of beginning that doesn't look like a beginning at all. It looks like an ordinary life, the kind you'd walk past on the street without a second thought. Richard Keene was born on March 7, 1970, in a small brick house on Alder Street in Camden, New Jersey. The house had a cracked front step that his father, Walter Keene, always said he was going to fix, but never did. The kitchen smelled like coffee in the morning and onions in the evening, and something damp and old in between that never went away no matter how many times his mother scrubbed the baseboards. Richard's mother, the woman he grew up calling his mother, was named Patricia Keene. She was tall, thin, had sharp cheekbones and sharper opinions, and she ran that house like a courtroom. Everything had a rule. Shoes off at the door, no elbows on the table, homework before television, church on Sunday, silence when Patricia was on the phone. Richard obeyed every rule because disobedience in that house didn't come with warnings. It came with consequences delivered so quickly that by the time you understood what you'd done wrong, the punishment was already over. Walter worked at a chemical plant across the river. He left at 5 in the morning and came back smelling like bleach and something metallic that stuck to his clothes even after washing. He was a quiet man, not shy, just used up by the time he got home. He'd sit in the brown recliner in the living room, eat dinner from a tray, and fall asleep before the evening news was over. Richard loved his father in the careful, distant way that sons love fathers who are physically present but emotionally unreachable. He learned early that Walter's love was expressed through labor, not language, through the fact that the lights stayed on, the fridge stayed full, and the cracked step never actually broke, even though it was never fixed. Patricia, on the other hand, was very present. She managed Richard's life with the precision of a general directing a campaign. She chose his clothes. She chose his friends. She monitored his grades with the intensity of a woman who believed that her son's performance was a direct reflection of her own worth. Richard was not allowed to be average. Average was a personal insult to Patricia Keene. And so Richard became excellent, not out of ambition, but out of compliance. He graduated 3rd in his class. He earned a scholarship to Rutgers. He got a degree in biochemistry. And he built a pharmaceutical company called Keene Medical Solutions that by the time he was 40 had contracts with 3 major hospital systems and was generating $50 million a year in revenue. Now, here is where you need to pay attention, because the woman at the center of this story didn't arrive in Richard's life with a bang. She arrived the way all the most important people arrive, quietly, through a side door, carrying nothing but a bag and a willingness to work. Her name was Dolores Reyes. She was 51 years old the day she showed up at Richard's penthouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan to interview for the position of live-in housekeeper. She was short, maybe 5'2", with thick black hair she kept in a braid that hung over one shoulder, and hands that were rough and cracked from decades of cleaning, cooking, and holding things together. She wore a navy blue dress that was clean but not new, and flat shoes that had been resoled at least twice. She carried a vinyl bag with one change of clothes, a Bible, a photograph in a plastic sleeve, and the diary. She didn't carry references. She didn't have a resume. What she had was a face that looked like it had been through something and come out the other side holding on to just enough to keep walking. Richard almost didn't hire her. His assistant, a woman named Jocelyn, had lined up 6 candidates. Jocelyn preferred a younger woman from an agency, someone with a list of credentials and a background check on file. But Dolores had been recommended by the doorman of Richard's building, a man named Eduardo, who told Richard that Dolores had cleaned his mother's apartment for 9 years without missing a single day, and had never taken a sick day, and had once stayed overnight when his mother fell ill because she didn't want the old woman to be alone. Eduardo said, "Mr. Keene, I've known a lot of people in this building. Dolores is the only one I'd trust with my own mother." Richard hired her that afternoon. That was in 2009. Dolores moved into the small room at the back of the penthouse, the one next to the laundry, the one with no window, just a vent that pushed warm air from the dryer through the wall. She didn't complain about the room. She hung a small wooden cross above the bed, placed the photograph on the nightstand, and set the diary in the top drawer. She began working the next morning at 5:30, and from that day forward, for 11 years, Dolores Reyes cleaned Richard Keene's home, cooked his meals, washed his clothes, organized his life, and said almost nothing about herself. Now, Dolores was not a silent woman in the way that shy people are silent. She was warm. She hummed while she cleaned, old songs in Spanish that Richard didn't understand but that filled the apartment with a softness it had never had before. She remembered that Richard liked his coffee with 2 sugars and no cream. She remembered that he hated the smell of lavender but liked the smell of lemon. She ironed his shirts in the order he would wear them, Monday through Friday, left to right in the closet, with the ties he would likely match draped over each hanger. She cooked dishes that tasted like someone's grandmother had made them. Arroz con pollo on Tuesdays, sopa de fideo on cold days, a bread pudding on Sundays that Richard once said was the best thing he had ever eaten. Dolores smiled when he said that. She smiled a lot, but it was the kind of smile that lived on top of something heavier, like a tablecloth thrown over a broken table to make it look presentable. Richard noticed the diary once, early on. He saw Dolores writing in it one evening when he came home late from a board meeting. She was sitting in the kitchen, the diary open in front of her, a cup of tea beside it. When she saw Richard, she closed it quickly, not guiltily, just privately. Richard said, "Keeping a journal?" Dolores nodded. "It helps me remember," she said. Richard didn't ask what she was remembering. He was not, at that point in his life, the kind of man who asked follow-up questions about other people's inner lives. He was busy, he was successful, and he had been raised by Patricia Keene, who had taught him that curiosity about the help was unnecessary, and worse, undignified. But what Richard didn't know, what he wouldn't know for 11 years, was that Dolores was not just writing about her day. She was writing about him, about his habits, his moods, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was stressed, the way he ate standing up when he was sad, the way he kept a photograph of Patricia on his desk but never called her. She wrote about the dinners she cooked for him, about the shirts she ironed, about the conversations she overheard and the ones she wished she could have. And between those entries, woven so carefully into the daily observations that you wouldn't notice them unless you were reading very closely, were the sentences that would eventually break Richard Keene's heart. He has his grandfather's hands. He laughs exactly like Walter did. Today he got angry at the phone, and for a moment I saw my father's face in his. And the one that appeared over and over, sometimes once a week, sometimes twice, always written in the same careful hand. He does not know I am his mother. But that truth was far worse than anyone imagined. Let me tell you about Patricia. Patricia Keene was not Richard's biological mother. She had never been pregnant. She had never given birth. She had wanted children badly. She and Walter had tried for 7 years. And when the doctors told her it wasn't going to happen, something in Patricia hardened. Not visibly. She didn't cry. She didn't grieve in any way that other people could see. She simply decided that the problem would be solved, and she solved it the way she solved everything, with control and precision, and a total unwillingness to let the world tell her no. In 1969, Patricia's younger sister Grace had married a man named Tomas Reyes. Grace was 20 years old. Tomas was 23. He worked construction. Grace cleaned houses. They lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Trenton, New Jersey, and they were poor in the way that young couples are poor. Not starving, but counting. Grace got pregnant in the spring of 1969. She was happy. Tomas was happy. Patricia was strategic. Now you need to understand something about Patricia and Grace. They were not close the way sisters are supposed to be close. Patricia was 8 years older. She had raised Grace after their mother died when Grace was 11, and the dynamic between them was not sisterly. It was parental. Patricia gave orders. Grace followed them. Patricia decided what was acceptable. Grace accepted it. And when Grace got pregnant at 20, unmarried at the time of conception, though married by the time the baby came, Patricia saw not a joyful event, but an opportunity. What Patricia did next was something that Grace would carry for the rest of her life. Patricia went to Grace's apartment 3 months before the baby was due. She sat at the kitchen table, Grace's kitchen, Grace's table, and laid out the situation as she saw it. Grace and Tomas had no money. They had no insurance. They were living in a one-bedroom apartment where the heat didn't always work. The baby would need things: a crib, a doctor, formula, clothes. Patricia and Walter, on the other hand, had a house. They had insurance. They had stability. Patricia told Grace that the most loving thing she could do, the most responsible, the most selfless, was to let Patricia and Walter raise the baby. Not adopt the baby legally, not formally, just raise it as theirs. Grace would still see the child. Grace would still be in its life. She would just be the aunt, not the mother, the aunt. Grace said no. She said it immediately, reflexively, the way a person says no to something they cannot even fully process. Patricia did not argue. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply stood up, put on her coat, and said, "Think about what's best for the child, Grace, not what's best for you." And then she left. But Patricia came back. She came back 3 more times over the next 2 months, each time with more pressure, each time with a new argument. She came with Walter once, and Walter, who had never been good at standing up to his wife, sat in the corner and said nothing, while Patricia explained that the baby deserved better. She came with their cousin Mabel, who Patricia had briefed beforehand, and Mabel said, "Grace, honey, think about the child." Every visit was a siege. And Grace, 20 years old, 7 months pregnant, exhausted, broke, and conditioned since childhood to follow her sister's lead, finally broke. She said yes. Richard was born on March 7, 1970, at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton. Grace held him for 4 hours. She counted his fingers. She counted his toes. She pressed her nose against the top of his head and breathed in the smell of him until it was the only thing in the world. And then Patricia came. She had a car seat. She had a bag of baby clothes. She had the expression of a woman who was collecting something she had already decided was hers. Grace handed the baby over. Tomas stood in the hallway and punched the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. A nurse heard it and came running. Nobody explained what had happened. Nobody could. And that single moment set off a chain of events nobody could stop. Grace and Tomas tried to stay in Richard's life. They came to Camden on weekends. They brought small gifts, a stuffed bear, a rattle, a pair of tiny socks Grace had knitted herself. But Patricia managed the visits the way she managed everything. She set the times. She controlled the length. And she began, slowly and deliberately, to push Grace to the edges. When Richard was 2, Patricia told Grace that the visits were confusing the boy. He didn't understand why this woman kept showing up. When Richard was 3, Patricia told Grace that Tomas was too loud, and it was upsetting the baby. When Richard was 4, Patricia told Grace that it was best if they stopped coming altogether. "You can call on birthdays," Patricia said, "but the visits need to stop, for Richard's sake." Grace stopped coming. but she never stopped watching. She moved to New York in 1980, divorced from Tomas by then, who had gone back to Puerto Rico, broken by a grief he couldn't name and an anger he couldn't direct. Grace cleaned houses, she cleaned offices, she cleaned apartments on the Upper East Side of Manhattan where women like Patricia lived, and she cleaned them well because cleaning was the only thing she could control in a life that had been rearranged by someone else's will. She changed her name, not legally but practically. She started going by her mother's maiden name, Reyes. Dolores was her middle name. She became Dolores Reyes because Grace Keene was a woman who had given away her son, and Dolores Reyes was a woman who could start over. But she kept the diary. She started writing in it the day she handed Richard to Patricia, and she never stopped. For 39 years, Dolores lived within 20 miles of her son and never told him the truth. She watched him from the edges. She read about his company in the newspaper. She saw his photograph at a charity event in a magazine in a doctor's waiting room, and she cut it out and put it in the vinyl bag she carried everywhere. And then, in 2009, when Eduardo the doorman told her about the housekeeper job at Richard Keene's penthouse, Dolores felt something she hadn't felt in decades. She felt the possibility of proximity. Not reunion, not confession, just closeness. The chance to be in the same room as her son, to cook for him, to iron his shirts, to hear him laugh and see his father's hands on his body and know, even if he never knew, that she was there. She took the job. She moved into the windowless room. She cooked arroz con pollo on Tuesdays because that was what her mother had cooked for her. She made bread pudding on Sundays because Tomas had loved bread pudding, and Richard had Tomas's mouth, and she wanted to feed something of his father back into him without him knowing. She ironed his shirts in order because she knew he was the kind of man who needed things to be in order. She had built that into him during the 4 hours she held him as a newborn, pressing her heartbeat against his chest until his breathing matched hers, organizing the rhythm of his life before he could even open his eyes. Now you might be wondering how Richard found the diary, and that is where this story breaks open. In September 2020, Dolores collapsed in the kitchen. It was early morning, 5:45, and she was making Richard's coffee the way she always did. 2 sugars, no cream. The cup was in her hand when her vision blurred and her legs gave out and she went down, pulling the cup with her, and the coffee spilled across the marble floor in a brown river that Richard found when he walked in 10 minutes later. Dolores was on the floor. She was conscious but disoriented. Richard called an ambulance. The paramedics took her to Mount Sinai. The doctor told Richard that Dolores had suffered a minor stroke, that she had high blood pressure that had been unmanaged for years, and that she would need to rest for several weeks. Richard nodded. He paid for a private room. He sent flowers, white lilies, because he'd seen them in her room and assumed she liked them. She did like them. They were the flowers Tomas had given her on their wedding day. Richard didn't know that. While Dolores was in the hospital, Richard needed something from her room, a set of spare keys she kept in her nightstand drawer. He had never been in Dolores's room before. In 11 years, he had never opened that door. He felt strange doing it now, intrusive, almost guilty, but he needed the keys. He opened the drawer. Inside were the keys, a rosary, the plastic-sleeved photograph, which he glanced at and saw a young woman holding a baby but didn't examine closely, and the diary. Richard didn't mean to read it. He picked it up because it was sitting on top of the keys, and when he moved it, it fell open to a page near the middle. His eyes caught a sentence before he could look away. He rubbed the back of his neck 3 times today. He does this when the board meeting doesn't go well. His grandfather used to do the same thing. Richard frowned. His grandfather? Dolores had never met his grandfather. Walter's father had died in 1965, 5 years before Richard was born. Why would Dolores write about his grandfather? He read the next line. I wanted to tell him that the neck thing comes from the Reyes side. My father did it too. But I can't. I can never tell him. Richard sat down on Dolores's bed. The mattress was thin and the springs creaked under his weight, and he thought, briefly and absurdly, that this was the most uncomfortable bed he had ever sat on, and that his maid had been sleeping on it for 11 years. He opened the diary to the first page. The date was March 7th, 1970, his birthday. The first entry read, Today I held my son for 4 hours. I counted his fingers. I counted his toes. I pressed my face against his head and I breathed him in. Then my sister came and took him. But the real shock was still coming. Richard read for 3 hours. He sat on that thin mattress in that windowless room, and he read 11 years of entries. He read about the coffee and the shirts and the bread pudding. He read about the arroz con pollo. Why Tuesdays? Why that recipe? Why the specific way she cut the onions small because her mother had cut them small, and her mother's mother had cut them small, and the smallness of the onions was a thread that connected 4 generations of women to a man who didn't know any of them. He read about the nights Dolores stood in the hallway outside his bedroom and listened to him breathe. He read about the time he was sick with the flu and she sat in the kitchen all night making soup she knew he wouldn't eat, not because the soup would help, but because the act of making it was the closest she could come to holding him. He read about Patricia, my sister, who took my child and turned herself into his mother and turned me into a stranger. And then he reached the entry from the previous Christmas. Richard had been alone. He had no wife. His marriage had ended in 2014. He had no children. Patricia hadn't visited. He had eaten takeout at the kitchen island while Dolores cleaned around him, and at one point he had said, "Dolores, do you have family?" And she had said, "I have everything I need right here, Mr. Keene." The diary entry for that night read, "He asked me if I have family. I was standing 3 feet away from him. I am his family. I am the only real family he has ever had. And I couldn't tell him. I smiled and I lied, and I went to my room, and I cried into the pillow so he wouldn't hear. 11 years I have been 3 feet away. It might as well be 1,000 miles. Richard closed the diary. He pressed it against his chest. And that is when he made the sound. Not a word, not a cry. Just the low, guttural release of a man whose entire understanding of his life had just been pulled out from under him like a rug. What Richard was about to discover would change everything. He drove to Camden that afternoon. He didn't call ahead. He pulled into the driveway of the brick house on Alder Street. The cracked step had finally been replaced, he noticed, though the new one didn't match the old brick. And he knocked on the door. Patricia opened it. She was 81 years old. Her hair was white. Her back was straight. She was wearing a cardigan and pearls, and the expression of a woman who had never once questioned whether she was right about anything. "Richard," she said, "this is a surprise." Richard held up the diary. "Who is Dolores Reyes?" he asked. Patricia's face didn't change. Not a muscle. Not a flicker. She looked at the diary the way a person looks at a bill they've been expecting, with resignation, not surprise. She stepped aside. Richard walked in. The house smelled the same. Coffee and onions, and that damp undertone that decades of scrubbing had never removed. Patricia sat in the living room. Richard stood. "She's your maid," Patricia said. "She says she's my mother." Patricia folded her hands in her lap. Her rings clicked against each other. 3 rings, all gold, all gifts from Walter, who had died in 2011 without ever telling Richard the truth either. "Grace was 20 years old," Patricia said. "She had nothing. She couldn't raise a child. I gave you a life." "You took me," Richard said. "I saved you. You told her to stop visiting. The visits were confusing you. I was 4 years old. Everything was confusing." Patricia looked at him the way she had always looked at him, with the particular intensity of a woman who loved her child fiercely and controlled him completely and could not tell the difference between the two. "I raised you, Richard. I fed you. I drove you to school. I sat in the front row at every graduation. I gave you structure and discipline and a life that Grace could never have given you. She cleaned houses. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with no heat. What kind of life would you have had?" Richard said nothing for a long time. He stood in the living room of the house where he grew up, holding a diary written by a woman who had been 3 feet away from him for 11 years, and he felt the architecture of his entire childhood rearrange itself. Every memory shifted. Patricia choosing his clothes. Was that love or ownership? Patricia monitoring his grades. Was that encouragement or performance? Patricia cutting Grace out of his life. Was that protection or theft? He asked her one question. Just one. Did she want to give me up? Patricia's mouth tightened. For the first time in Richard's life, he saw something behind her eyes that looked like guilt. Not much. Just a shadow. A flicker that lasted half a second before the control reasserted itself. She agreed, Patricia said. That's not what I asked. Patricia didn't answer. She looked at the window. The light was coming through the curtains. Late afternoon light, golden. The kind of light that makes old rooms look warm even when they're not. Richard waited. Patricia didn't speak. Her silence was the loudest thing in the room, and it told Richard everything he needed to know. He drove back to New York. He went to Mount Sinai. He walked into Dolores's room. She was sitting up in bed, wearing a hospital gown, her braid undone, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked small against the white sheets. Smaller than she looked in the kitchen. Smaller than she looked when she was working. As if labor had been the thing holding her upright, and without it she was deflating. The white lilies were on the nightstand. The room smelled like disinfectant and flowers. She looked up when Richard walked in, and her face did the thing it always did when she saw him. It opened, briefly, before she caught herself and rearranged it into the pleasant, professional expression of a housekeeper greeting her employer. But this time Richard saw through it. He saw the opening. He saw the mother behind the maid. He held up the diary. Dolores's face went white. Her hands gripped the sheets. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Richard pulled a chair to the side of her bed and sat down. And for the first time in their 11 years together, they were at the same height, face to face, neither one standing while the other sat. I read it, Richard said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. All of it. Dolores's eyes filled. She didn't look away. She didn't apologize. She didn't try to explain. She just looked at him with a face that held 39 years of silence and 11 years of proximity and a lifetime of cooking and cleaning and ironing as a substitute for holding. Why didn't you tell me? Richard asked. Dolores's chin trembled. Because you were happy, she whispered. You had a good life. You had the life Patricia promised you would have, and I thought, if I told you, I would take that away. I would make you doubt everything. I would make your childhood a lie. She paused. So I stayed close. That was enough. Being close was enough. It wasn't enough, Richard said. It wasn't enough for you, and it wasn't enough for me. I've been eating your bread pudding for 11 years, and I didn't know it was my father's recipe. Dolores made a sound, half laugh, half sob. Tomas loved that bread pudding. He would eat the whole pan if I let him. She looked at Richard's hands. You have his hands, you know. The long fingers. The way you hold a cup, palm around the side, not the handle. That's Tomas. Richard looked at his own hands. He had been holding cups that way his entire life. No one had ever told him why. If you think that was the most emotional part of this story, stay with us, because what happens next will surprise you. Richard went home that night and sat in the kitchen where Dolores had spent 11 years cooking meals that were coded messages from a life he didn't know he'd had. He called Jocelyn and told her to cancel his meetings for the rest of the week. He called his lawyer and asked about the legal implications of an informal adoption conducted in 1970 with no documentation. The lawyer said it was complicated. There were no papers, no court order, no legal transfer of custody. Patricia and Walter had simply taken the baby and raised him. In 1970, in that community, among those people, nobody had asked questions. Over the next week, Richard did something he had never done in his adult life. He slowed down. He went to the hospital every day. He sat with Dolores for hours. He asked her about Tomas. He asked her about Grace, about who Grace had been before she became Dolores, before the name change, before the 39 years of distance. Dolores told him about the apartment in Trenton with the heat that didn't work. She told him about the stuffed bear she'd brought to Camden that Patricia had put in the closet and never given to him. She told him about the pair of tiny socks she'd knitted, blue with a white stripe, that she'd brought to the last visit before Patricia told her to stop coming. She told him that she still had those socks. They were in the vinyl bag. They had been in every bag she'd carried for 39 years. Richard said, "I want to see them." Dolores hesitated. Then she nodded. Richard went back to the penthouse, went into the windowless room, and opened the vinyl bag. Inside, with the Bible, the photograph, he looked at it closely this time and saw a young woman with dark hair and wide eyes holding a baby wrapped in a white blanket. And the young woman was Dolores, and the baby was him. And a pair of blue baby socks with a white stripe. They were impossibly small. He held them in his palm and they weighed nothing, and they weighed everything. He drove to the hospital with the socks in his jacket pocket. He walked into the room and sat in the chair beside the bed and placed the socks on the blanket between them. Dolores looked at them. She picked one up with her rough, cracked fingers and held it against her cheek and closed her eyes. 39 years, she said. I carried those socks for 39 years. Richard reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he had ever touched Dolores Reyes. 11 years of her cooking his meals, washing his clothes, cleaning his home, and he had never once touched her hand. Her skin was rough and warm, and her fingers curled around his immediately, instinctively, the way a hand curls around something it has been waiting to hold. I need you to hear something, Richard said. His voice was thick. I don't care about Patricia's reasons. I don't care about the house in Camden or the school or the grades or the career. None of that means what I thought it meant. The only thing in my life that has felt like home, the only thing that has felt like someone actually knew me, was the last 11 years. In this apartment. With you. Dolores's eyes overflowed. She squeezed his hand. You've been my mother this whole time, Richard said. I just didn't know it. I was always your mother, Dolores whispered. From the first breath, from the first heartbeat. Patricia raised you. But I have been your mother every second of every day since March 7th, 1970. Even when I couldn't touch you. Even when I couldn't say your name. Even in that room with no window, I was your mother. And that is when Richard said the line that the nurses on that floor would talk about for years afterward. He leaned forward, his hand still holding hers, his eyes red, his voice barely audible. He said, You cooked my father's bread pudding every Sunday for 11 years, and I never asked you why. I never asked you a single question about your life. And you stayed anyway. That is not loyalty. That is not service. That is the kind of love that should have its own word because love is not big enough. Dolores smiled. The real smile. Not the one she wore over the broken table. The one underneath. The one that had been waiting for 39 years for someone to lift the cloth and see what was really there. Now there were consequences. There had to be. A truth this size doesn't come to light without shaking every wall in the house. Richard confronted Patricia one more time. He drove to Camden with the diary, the photograph, and the blue socks. He set them on the kitchen table, the same table where Patricia had sat 39 years earlier and told a 20-year-old woman that the most loving thing she could do was give up her child. Patricia looked at the items. She looked at Richard. I did what I thought was right, Patricia said. You did what you wanted, Richard said. There's a difference. And the fact that you can't see it, after all these years, tells me everything I need to know. Patricia's face cracked. Not a lot. Just enough. She reached for the socks, the blue socks with the white stripe, and her hands stopped in the air above them, trembling, and then she pulled it back. She couldn't touch them. Those socks were evidence of something she had taken, and touching them would mean admitting it. And Patricia Keene had never in her life admitted to being wrong about anything. Richard said, I'm not going to stop coming to see you. You raised me. That happened. I can't undo it, and I wouldn't want to. You're part of who I am. But Dolores is coming home. To my home. Not as my maid, as my mother. And you're going to have to live with the fact that the woman you pushed out of my life spent 11 years ironing my shirts and cooking my meals 3 feet away from me. And she did it because being close to me was the only thing she had left. He paused. You took everything else. Patricia said nothing. She sat in the living room with her hands folded and her pearls and her straight back, And she looked, for the first time in Richard's life, like what she actually was. A woman who had loved too hard, and controlled too much, and confused possession with motherhood, until the two were welded together so tightly that she couldn't separate them even when the truth was sitting on her kitchen table in the form of a pair of baby socks. What happened next showed the kind of man Richard really was. He didn't cut Patricia off. He didn't punish her. He did something harder. He held both truths at the same time. Patricia had raised him. Patricia had also stolen him. Both things were true. And Richard was the kind of man, maybe because of Patricia's discipline, maybe because of Dolores's patience, maybe because of Tomas's hands and Grace's heart, who could hold two contradictory truths without needing to destroy one to keep the other. Dolores came home from the hospital in late October. Richard had renovated the room. Not the windowless one, a real room. The guest room on the south side of the penthouse, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Central Park. He had the walls painted warm yellow. He put fresh white lilies on the nightstand. He hung the wooden cross above the bed. And he placed the photograph, the young woman holding the baby, in a silver frame on the dresser. Dolores walked in and stopped. She looked at the windows. She looked at the light pouring across the hardwood floor. She looked at the lilies. She said, "This is too much." "It's not enough," Richard said. 11 years in a room with no window. It will never be enough. Dolores sat on the bed. It was soft. She pressed her hands into the mattress and something in her face changed. A loosening, a release, as if a muscle she'd been clenching for decades had finally been allowed to let go. She looked at the photograph in the silver frame. She looked at the baby in the picture. She looked at the man standing in the doorway. "I used to imagine this," she said quietly. "In the room with the vent. I would lie in bed and imagine that the wall wasn't there. That the apartment was just one big room, and you were sleeping on the other side and I could hear you breathe. That's what I pretended." She touched the silver frame. "And now there are windows." Richard sat beside her. They sat together on the bed in the yellow room with the October lights streaming across the floor, and they were quiet. They didn't need to talk. They had 11 years of proximity and 39 years of distance, and the specific, impossible weight of a mother and son sitting side by side for the first time as mother and son. And the silence was not empty. It was full. In the months that followed, things changed the way things change when the truth finally settles. Slowly, unevenly, with some things breaking and other things growing in the cracks. Richard reduced his hours at the company. He hired a CEO to run the day-to-day operations. He started cooking, badly at first, comically badly, burning rice and oversalting everything. Because Dolores told him that Tomas had been a terrible cook too, and that it was genetic, and that the Reyes men were built for eating, not making. She sat at the kitchen island and directed him the way a conductor directs an orchestra, and he followed her instructions the way he had once followed Patricia's, except this time the compliance didn't come from fear. It came from want. He tracked down information about Tomas. Tomas had returned to Bayamon, Puerto Rico in 1982. He had remarried. He had 2 more children. He had died of a heart attack in 2005 at the age of 58. Richard flew to Bayamon and visited Tomas's grave. He stood in a cemetery on a hillside overlooking the ocean, and he talked to a headstone the way Isaiah talked to a fire helmet, the way people talk to the dead when the living failed to tell them what they needed to hear. He told Tomas about the bread pudding. He told him about the hands. He told him about the way he held a cup. And then he placed the blue baby socks, the ones Grace had knitted, the ones Dolores had carried for 39 years, on the grass beside the headstone and said, "She kept them. She kept everything." On Christmas Day 2020, Richard and Dolores sat at the long dining table in the penthouse. It was the same table where Richard had eaten thousands of meals alone, or with business associates, or with the ex-wife who had told him during the divorce that he was emotionally absent, a phrase that had hurt him at the time, but that he now understood differently, because how could he have been emotionally present when the most important emotional truth of his life had been hidden in a windowless room at the back of his own apartment. Dolores had cooked arroz con pollo, sopa de fideo, red pudding. The table was set for two. Richard poured 2 glasses of wine. "Feliz Navidad, Mama," Richard said. It was the first time he had called her that. Dolores's hand stopped midway to her glass. Her chin trembled. Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and nodded once, twice, 3 times, quickly, the way a person nods when speech is impossible and the head must do the work the voice cannot. "Feliz Navidad, mijo," she whispered. They ate dinner. The bread pudding was perfect. It was always perfect. And for the first time in Richard's life, he knew why. Because every Sunday for 11 years, a mother had made her son his father's favorite dessert, and the love was not in the sugar or the bread or the cream. The love was in the fact that she made it at all, that she stood in the kitchen of a man who didn't know she was his mother and cooked him a recipe that connected him to a father he'd never met. And she did it every single week without being asked, without being thanked, without being known. That is not bread pudding. That is a cathedral made of flour and silence. The next spring, Richard received a phone call from Camden. Patricia had fallen and broken her hip. Richard drove down. He brought Dolores. Patricia saw them walk in together, and her face did something complicated. Relief at seeing Richard, fear at seeing Dolores, and underneath both, a grief so old and so compressed that it had become almost geological, like a fossil buried under decades of rock. Dolores sat at Patricia's bedside. She didn't speak at first. She just sat. The 2 sisters, 82 and 70, looked at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with the 3 feet between the chair and the bed. Then Dolores reached out and took Patricia's hand. "I'm not going to forgive you today," Dolores said quietly. "Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not for a long time. But I'm here. Because you raised him well. I can see that. I can see it in the way he holds a door, in the way he says please and thank you, in the way he showed up today, even though he's angry at you." She paused. "You took my son, but you didn't ruin him. And I need you to know, that is the only reason I am sitting in this chair." Patricia's hand tightened around Dolores's. A tear ran down the side of her face into the pillow. She didn't wipe it. She let it go. Maybe for the first time. Today, Dolores Reyes lives in the yellow room with the windows. She is 65 years old. She no longer cleans. She no longer cooks. Well, she does cook, but now she cooks because she wants to, not because it's her job. Richard calls her Mama. He says it easily now, the way a person says a word they've been waiting their whole life to learn. The diary sits on the dresser beside the silver-framed photograph. Dolores still writes in it, but the entries are different now. They don't say, "He does not know I am his mother." They say things like, "Richard burned the rice again today. Tomas would have laughed." And, "My son called me Mama twice before breakfast. I will never get used to the sound of it. I hope I never do." And Patricia? Patricia is still in Camden. Richard visits every 2 weeks. He brings Dolores sometimes. The conversations are careful and short, the way conversations are when forgiveness is in progress but not yet complete. But last month, something happened that neither Richard nor Dolores expected. Patricia called the penthouse on a Tuesday evening. Dolores answered. Patricia said, "Is this Dolores?" Dolores said yes. Patricia said, "I made something for you. Can you come get it?" Dolores drove to Camden the next day. Patricia handed her a shoebox. Inside were 47 items: birthday cards, school photos, report cards, Christmas ornaments Richard had made in elementary school. 47 pieces of a childhood that Dolores had missed. Patricia had kept them. All of them. For 53 years. She said, "These belong to you. They always did." Dolores held the shoebox in the car and cried for 30 minutes before she could drive home. There is a pair of baby socks in a cemetery in Bayamón, Puerto Rico. sitting beside a headstone that belongs to a man named Tomas Reyes. They are blue with a white stripe. They were knitted by a 20-year-old woman who loved her son so much that she carried them for 39 years. And then her son carried them to the grave of the father he never met and placed them there because some things need to go home, even if home is a hillside in another country. And in a penthouse in Manhattan, in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over Central Park, a woman writes in a diary every night. She has written in it for 53 years, and the most recent entry, written in the same careful handwriting that has never changed, says, "He called me Mama again today. 53 years. I would wait 53 more." And that's where we'll leave this story. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what lesson did you take from this? See you next time.